Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ayden Férdeline. I am a public interest technologist, and I was also a grantee in the first cohort of Grant for the Web. Really excited to be here today among friends, because what you're working on matters. You are building pathways to financial inclusion. You are bringing people together. And speaking of that, I'm happy to be joined on this panel also amongst friends. To my left, we have Ayden Magallanes, who is Senior Counsel at the Wikimedia Foundation and also Secretary of the Internet Law and Policy Foundry, where I also just disclose I am also a fellow. And we have Xiaoji Song, who is an artist and researcher based in Berlin. And joining us remotely, we have Stephanie Perrin, who led the drafting initiative that resulted in Canada's current privacy legislation. And while she is far too modest to mention this, she was also the recipient of the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Pioneer Award back in 2001. So thank you, Stephanie, for joining us. Thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Xiaozi. Really pleased to have all of you on stage today to be discussing what may be an uncontroversial statement to make at the moment, which is that the internet, and particularly the advertiser-supported internet that we are all using on a daily basis, has some flaws. It's broken. And so the questions that we're debating is, how do we solve this? And also, are web monetization protocols part of the solution to some of the challenges that the internet faces? And with that, I'm going to put the first question to you, Stephanie. And it's a broad one, and that is, what is wrong with our advertiser-supported internet at the moment? And also, why haven't we been able to solve these problems already through regulation?
I apologize if you're speaking to me, Ayden. I can't hear because of the back chatter. I hear other voices, but not yours. So that's been a bit of a problem.
Okay.
So if you could repeat the question, it seems to be a bit better now.
Perfect. Hopefully you can hear me now. If not, we'll come back in a moment. The question was, from a privacy perspective, what is wrong with our current advertiser-supported internet? And why have we not been able to solve some of these challenges through regulation?
Well, I think one of the key things is we bet on the wrong horse back in about 1998. 1998 was the year that the European Union was passing its directive and making it necessary for the nation state.
I think we just lost you, Stephanie, if you're still able to hear us.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm still hearing a lot of background noise, but I'm talking over it. So 98, the European Union was passing their data protection directive. States within the union had to fall into line and pass legislation. Canada was, we were drafting ours in Canada, but the United States did not pass data protection legislation. And that meant that there was, so we've had a 20-year struggle arguing about whether or not they should. Now, the core issues in terms of privacy problems with the advertiser-supported internet is we've got, as a result, deep profiling of every user. In competitive markets for those profiles. We've got intrusion into and surveillance of our various devices in ways that are competitive between the companies, not user-friendly or beneficial, and it's up to civil society to come up with ways to educate consumers to protect themselves, because that's not coming from the core platform operators. And of course, there's always the risk through insecure payment systems that are integrated into the provision of services. So those are three things. Obviously, we could talk all day about what's wrong with the current model, but those are the three core ones. And we must understand that back in 98, we could have started to work on token systems, secure payments, but we didn't, because the entire market started to focus on knowing the customer and profiling and manipulating the customer. And that is what we're trying to correct now. So I hope that answers the question.
It does. Thank you, Stephanie. And just to follow up, so if we take an example of an emerging technology, and I'm thinking here perhaps the browser extension that Coil has developed, that in many ways offers total privacy by not tracking audiences at all, is this one of those corrections that you think is necessary? But I'm also wondering, if we are not tracking audiences, if we're not even at the aggregate level able to allow websites to customize and to personalize content through their recommender systems like they do today, what is that going to mean? Are consumers going to voluntarily adopt these technologies, or is there going to be a market failure and consumers will continue to use these problematic alternatives that are already out there?
Well, I think the key thing to remember is that we have things in tension here. I want to protect my privacy. I don't want to become the subject of profiles that are being traded amongst people I don't trust, companies I don't trust. But that doesn't mean that I want to get away from the historical niche taste groups. That's not really an expression. I hope you understand what I mean. In other words, if I like beat poetry, I will congregate with folks who like it. I'll go to places where I can hear it live. I will buy things. I will trust journals that cater to that taste. That's an older example, beat poetry, but I'm going back to the old MeatSpace days when there were separate communities. The way we're understanding communities, and that's air quotes required here, today, those communities are being set and established and favored or disfavored by the platforms. So we want to have payments that are anonymous to the platforms, but identifiable to user groups. In other words, I still want to be able to know what people whose work I read and whose work I trust, what they're following, what they're doing. So there is this tension, and therefore I think that whatever browser extension we use, it has to be able to do both these jobs. It has to stimulate free thinking, experimentation, the ability to go and read something that might have you typecast as, oh, who knows, a Nazi. If I want to read Mein Kampf today, it's not because I want to turn into a Nazi, it's because I want to understand the rise in authoritarian leaders from the perspective of how it happened in the 30s. So that's the kind of freedom of thinking and dissent and content availability that we want to strive for. So you have to balance the two, and I'm sure it can be done. It's just a question of where in the layers identification takes place.
Xiaoji, I saw you nodding your head at several times as Stephanie spoke there. I'm curious if you have any follow-ups there, particularly on the trade-offs that we can accept when balancing privacy and functionality.
First, thank you very much for having me. Yes, indeed, I was nodding my head a lot because I think, let's say, if we really talk about trade-offs, I always have a bit questions on, I think not only on the one side, I agree with what Stephanie was saying, that I definitely think that a different form of internet would not only, let's say, I would even go further to argue that the diversity and plurality of the content would even be encouraged, in the sense that I don't just think that there's a chance for the niche taste and for different kind of macro taste to be accommodated, but also I would further argue that it might even be encouraged because of our current internet is with the echo chamber. I'm talking echo chamber, disinformation, misinformation, revenue-driven content recommendation. I I think when it comes to trade-off, however, what I would be questioning a little bit, and that's something that, even though I'm nodding, I'm still feeling uncertain about, is when we are really talking about our own preferences and our own, let's say, the preferences of a community and what the community really want, what kind of taste and what kind of content the communities really need, how much of those is really of our own choice after this years of platform heavily influencing what we consume and heavily influencing what we read and what kind of people we interact with. So for me, there's a little bit doubt there on the trade-off to say that I feel like this is in some way of a dynamic process. Yeah, so.
So the language that platforms, and I'm thinking social media platforms like Facebook, for example, often use to describe their recommender systems is that they're personalizing content to interest the individual, when of course that is not necessarily true. They are personalizing the content based upon what is going to attract engagement and therefore generate revenue for the platform. The incentives are a little bit different. It's not necessarily based upon what you want to see, but based upon what the platform thinks can show you that will allow your eyeballs to remain engaged on that page. And so one of the interesting things that I find, at least, about web monetization technologies is that we can change that incentive structure to an extent. So rather than there being that dependency on a platform, we can create potentially new middlemen or new intermediaries, or we can create an environment where creators with more niche audiences are still able to attract an audience for their work, to be remunerated for what they're producing, and that they are able to be directly funded by those who enjoy seeing what they are producing. At the same time, the payouts that some of these platforms, Koyo, for example, streams is quite low. I believe it's 36 cents per 1 hour of content. Curious what you think, Xiaoji, about whether, is that enough for a creator to live on? What kind of audience would you need to be getting through web monetization in order for this to be a viable alternative to platforms, centralized platforms like YouTube that are paying more, to be honest? And also whether it matters. Does it matter if someone can't make a living generating important content? Is there a more important principle that they are just receiving a contribution at all?
Thank you for the question. So before I answer the question, to just very firstly, quickly respond to some of your comments that you made here. What I find really interesting, let's say, in the last few years, we're all familiar with platform like Spotify. They like to publish by the end of the year what kind of music you like. So what have you listened to? This kind of data, when people are sharing it, I always find it really interesting that some people, there are a lot of things that people claim to like, and there are a lot of things people are actually consuming. Oftentimes, and a lot of music streaming platforms are doing that, but I'm always interested in really seeing sort of data report on what kind of content I'm actually consuming on social media and my friends. Because we always say that we care about certain things and we like certain things, but there are a lot of hidden patterns in our actual consumption that is a dissonance in what we say we care about, what represent our identity, and what we are actually driven into, what is the things that we actually like, but we just don't really want to admit it. So then to go back to that question, I think both of what I was talking about there about the preferences that we claim to like and the preferences we actually have, and also in which way creators should be funded or in which way creators should be monetized, these are the questions that I think we need to go back to. How do we define the quality of content? What kind of content we need in our digital future? And to be honest, when I first think about the question, my answer is no. That I definitely do not think with the micropayment creators can live with that, especially with niche taste, right? But I think the more important question is that we shouldn't have to, because if you are creating a niche content, this content, the quality of those content, they are not determined by the traffic you're getting. They're not determined by the size of audience. There are more ways and determinants of the quality of the content and the importance of the content, especially no matter when we're talking about art, politics, science. I'm often wanting to ask, in this kind of cases, where is the public funding on those things? Monetization models are very important, and they should serve as a basis, and they are definitely an important alternative. But as much as this is as an important alternative, we should not expect it to solve every problem we have in a society as a whole, as a global community, in our current global injustice and epidemic violence. All these problems need to be addressed. Outside of this, and there's only certain responsibilities that the technology can bear. And yeah, so I would say that would be my question that I would have still. After all this really insightful talks, that this is a question that I still really feel like we need to be careful with.
I think the problem, I'm sorry, I'm injecting my opinion here. I think the problem with public funding, though, is that it can be captured, and that certain actors, particularly when it comes to producing content that appeals to very niche audiences, particularly on political topics, is not necessarily going to be fundable through public means. Even in countries that have strong traditions of funding public service media, we still have these issues. Look at Hungary, for example. And so one of the things that I find very interesting about web monetization technologies is this idea that you are able, at the protocol level, to be able to sort of disintermediate and to be able to provide alternative ways of funding these voices. That being said, I'm going to bring Ellen into the conversation now. Thanks for waiting. And that's to do with the funding model that Wikimedia has, which is that it's a donation model. It also has a very novel governance structure that is quite, in my opinion, bottom-up. And so I'm curious about why Wikimedia has adopted this model, and why does it not simply rely on advertisements to fund its work like so much of the rest of the internet does?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I'm sure you all know about Wikipedia, one of the most popular websites in the world. Did you know that the average donation for us is US $15? Do you know that 80% of our donors, of our donation total, is from small donors like that? Did you know that only 2% of readers donate? So with that, those statistics in mind, I will also say Wikipedia still works today. Our funding model does work today. And whether or not to advertise has been discussed in the past. We do not currently advertise, and the community discussed that at large. There are some pros and cons. Some pros, like it would be an easy way to make money. We're very popular. Cons, and I think it's really, like they said in the discussion, which is publicly available, it would cheapen the encyclopedia. There would be a conflict of interest. How can you try to present encyclopedic information and also try to sell things? It would detract from what we're trying to do, which is provide free knowledge. And I think, and you didn't ask this, but another method of funding that has been discussed is paid editing, which might be more akin to like paying the contributors, like Xiaoji was talking about. And we also do not pay the editors. And people are like, but why? They do the work. And I think we don't pay the editors, firstly, because they also decided not to be paid. These are community decisions. Wikimedia Foundation just hosts, supports the projects and the community, the Wikimedia community, are the ones that make the decisions. But there's actually similar reasons, like the conflict of interest. Undisclosed paid editing is an issue on our projects, where people who have agendas or who are paid to have agendas edit things to bring people to a certain perspective. I'm talking about like medical device companies editing Wikipedia entries saying that certain surgeries are way more successful or less controversial, just removing the part that they're controversial to make their products sell more. So paid editing would remove a lot of the independence and the neutral point of view that we strive to have on our project, and that what makes Wikipedia successful today.
Thanks, Ellen. Stephanie, I'm gonna put the next question to you, so hoping that you can hear us still.
Yes.
Perfect. So most of us probably agree that accessing the internet, if not a human right per se, is at least something that should not be restricted. And the internet enables us to access to express our thoughts, to connect with others, to gain knowledge and information. However, if all of this is true and the internet is so critical in our world today, what does it mean if knowledge starts to be increasingly monetized? What is the risk here if all of the information that we need to access is paywalled in some way or requires a subscription to COIL, for example, in order to be able to unlock information that is currently free?
I think it's important to stress that, we have had access to literature and knowledge through libraries. And we may have a wonderful internet that comes to our door, but that hasn't replaced the library. And so there has to be a library equivalent in an online-only mode. And I'm thinking for remote participants who might not have access to the same resources, for the increasing numbers of disabled folks who can make use of knowledge through their devices. So we have to, once again, it's this balance and tension. How much we've put an awful lot of emphasis in the last 20 years on the independence of the individual, but these other basic public structures that we want to fund normally through governments or through donations, through foundations, have to be healthy and maintain their ability to provide access. And of course, they've had fights with the intermediaries for control of that and for how much they have to pay to get access to information that they can make available for free. So I think that's a key point. One should always be wary of plugging a book you haven't read, but I just heard about the new book by Rebecca Giblin and Cory Doctorow called Choke Point Capitalism, which basically goes after, she's a forensic auditor, and they go after some of the really corrupt practices, you have to name it, that have been going on with the big monopoly providers of information. I think if we, as an action item, were to go after those practices and try to democratize them, try to make room for smaller niche providers, try to provide payment systems that are indeed true micropayments, support the public library system, for lack of another word, I think we won't have a problem. I don't think we're going to price people behind paywalls. The existing paywall structure is very clumsy. I might want to read an article that a friend sends me that is paywalled. I don't necessarily want to subscribe for a full year. So micropayments answer all these questions. And to respond to your earlier question about is it enough? Well, I think we can afford to up the ante a bit. In terms of what we pay. I'll pay a nickel for an article. Granted, I'm in a Western country and I'm, not starving, but there can be a gradient system here, depending on the economies. Hope that answers your question.
It does. My one concern when it comes to micropayments is simply, does it actually fund the material that you're accessing. News, for example, has a very short shelf life. You read an article, maybe even 6 hours later, it may be out of date. Sure, longer investigative pieces might have a longer shelf life, but at the same time, if people are paying just a very small micropayment to read it, is it really able to cover the cost of producing that piece of content? That's the question I sometimes have.
Well, that is really something worthy of a lot of research. To be frank, the inquiries into the death of the newspapers in my country, in Canada, most of them went on 30 or 40 years ago, and we haven't really figured out what it would take to restore a free press in the country, and time's running out. We now no longer have effective community newspapers. They've all been bought out. It's one of the points they address in Choke Point Capitalism. So I think further research is needed, but it's not a reason to shy away from a payment system, because these guys aren't getting paid right now. The scams that are going on with the content controllers, with the big platforms, in terms of not paying the artists and not paying the providers and yanking back payments that once they've made them, it's kind of shocking. So I think that we should move forward and try these micropayment systems. They can't be any worse than what's going on now.
Thanks, Stephanie. So, Ellen, I'll put a follow-up question to you. So Stephanie was talking about the importance of libraries, and I'm curious what you think online equivalents could be. Are there certain websites, or is there certain knowledge that is so essential online that it should always be free to access?
Mm-hmm. I think you can probably guess my answer to this. I think Wikipedia is a great online resource, library, if you will. And I absolutely think that there is information out there that should be free to access. When I say free, I mean free as in beer, not as in speech. So we're talking in the context of money, in the context of web monetization. So you said you stopped shy of making access to knowledge like a human right. I think personally, it's pretty up there for me. Like, I think that information or knowledge that is local and accurate and reliable means, like, it's the lens through which we view the world around us. And I think that everybody has the right to access that knowledge, no matter where they live, or what language they speak, or what kind of currency they use. That information should be free for them. And I think that the Wikimedia model, it's not publicly funded, like you were talking about, Xiaoji, in that like governments don't support it. But I think it's publicly funded in that it's funded by the public. And so it's, a public good for the public good, somehow stepping away from our tendency to fall into the tragedy of the commons. We take care of Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is a good resource for all of us. And that is the hope. That is what the Wikimedia Foundation hopes to accomplish. That's what I hope to support as an attorney at the Wikimedia Foundation. So yeah.
Thanks. Xiaoji, I'll put the next question to you, which is that there are certain audience segments and certain creators who face unique challenges in monetizing their work. Queer people, for example, disproportionately demonetized on YouTube. Activists and advocates in authoritarian regimes like Iran, Russia, for example, are unable to fund their work because of sanctions that are imposed on the payment systems that many of us use. I'm curious what you think, particularly in the context of those people who are, to borrow a term that Ellen just used, contributing to public goods, who are doing important work in these spaces where, at the moment, conventional payment systems simply cannot accommodate them. What is the potential that you see in web monetization protocols for allowing these people to potentially be supported?
I think this is a very, very important question that I think this is a question kind of like I've been having this in mind throughout a lot of, let's say, the discussion we've been having. I definitely think on the one hand that web monetization protocol is a very good alternative, and let's put it in a way. This is something that we can see as a potential solution. But on the other hand, I am also thinking on existing examples of content monetization on platforms, existing platforms, and that include both platforms that, let's say, the social media platform we are commonly using, or thinking on certain, let's say, specific platforms in China that maybe people are not really familiar with here. I think the existing monetization in those platforms, in the long term, I don't necessarily see it as a way that really help those kind of creators. What I'm giving here is probably not really any sort of like a really concrete idea, because this is definitely an under-researched field that I think we need more empirical evidence on. First, what are the differences of the current monetization schemes in platforms, and how's that logic intervening with the web monetization protocol? What kind of lessons we can learn from the monetization schemes we currently have in many countries that are already being implemented in the long term. The second thing, I'm also thinking for those kind of creators, what are their actual goals of their work? I wonder web monetization, if it really brings them to the audience that they need, because their specific purpose on their work, that's either for visibility, for social and political impacts. Most of the time, I realize that withdrawing them, let's say, when they are demonetizing a certain platform, they're being disproportionately impacted by those platforms' algorithmic logic. Withdrawal from those centralized platforms does not always seem like a solution for the purpose of their work, because you still want to be engaging with the audience in those platforms. You still want to be the oppositional voices there. So I would say those are the things that I would put as a question, or let's say as important directions we need to go in research to really answer that question. And I don't see enough. I think there are certain fundamental conceptual differences between monetization on those platforms and monetization on the web.
Just to follow up on that, so web monetization technologies in the context of, say, Interledger protocol, purely transactional. COIL, for example, is not licensing content. It is not exercising editorial control over the content that is being produced, which is quite different from centralized platforms like YouTube, who are, through private ordering, enforcing their community guidelines, perhaps in an arbitrary way, perhaps based upon commercial interests. Curious what you think about this, because I think it's an important distinction, the fact that you're able to potentially receive payment for the content you're creating, absent the threat of being demonetized for putting perspectives out there that may be unpopular or undesired by the platform that is hosting it. It's sort of this unbundling, if you will, of payment for content and hosting of content.
I'm thinking a lot sometimes on, I think we have some discussion on the possible, let's say, access to legal resources for people who were under this kind of situation. But I think this depends on a few, let's say, conditions. I think the first is that there are certain cases where for oppositional voices or contentious publics, this kind of resource is not the most urgent one. And I think oftentimes those kind of resources, especially access to justice, access to legal help, they do not necessarily help with their cause. The second thing I was also thinking that is, I guess, relevant to your question is that we often fail to separate the global audience and the local audience for individuals who are actually working in those situations. If their purpose is archiving, or if their purpose is really to make certain things visible, then this is helpful. But not all of them have that purpose in mind with their content. I'm not sure if that answers your question, or do you have any?
I think it answers my question to an extent. That being said, I got the countdown that we have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to bring Stephanie back into the conversation quickly just to offer a brief closing remark. And maybe the one question that I'll put to you, Xiaoji, is, so when you're talking about the legal protections that you expect from a platform, maybe in your closing remarks you can clarify for me what you mean by that, and also whether you think that is, or how that could be the role, for example, of, in the context of a web monetization protocol where the content is not being licensed. How could that work? Because there is no sort of contractual relationship between the producer of that content and the payment provider. It sounds something, what I'm hearing is like you believe there's some sort of social responsibility potentially, but maybe you can elaborate on that in a moment. First though, Stephanie, any closing thoughts?
Thanks, Ayden. I think it's really important that we move forward and try a few things. So I'm in favor of trying micropayments and try to disambiguate the actual coin payment for receipt of content and profiling. I don't mind being profiled. I want to be profiled within my taste groups, within, I think of it more as curated content that I'm interested in. And right now, most of us subscribe to lists and get, to a certain extent, curated content. But there's no reason to hand that control over to the monopoly service providers. So that's one thing. I think it's important that more research is done on the economics, and that there be more transparency of how these big players are misusing the personal information that they're getting hold of about us and misusing their power in the marketplace. Wake up the competition departments of the world's countries and get them to enforce competition law. Stop the vertical integration, because that is what is snuffing out small artistic content providers. Personally, I'm going to read Choke Point Capitalism because I think that's a good start on understanding that. But I think it's important for foundations to fund more research into what's happening to the stifling of content and the homogenization of what appears. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Stephanie. Xiaoji, you have 60 seconds.
Okay. I would say that the very major point that I would want to bring today is that as a creator, I have really high hope, I think, or expectation on web monetization protocol, but not necessarily that in the sense that I expect it to solve every barriers I've ever faced, political barriers, economics barriers. I think we should understand monetization in a way that we are not putting all sort of responsibilities that we're not able to solve with any other field on it. But at the same time, I'm very interested also to understand, I think we should understand our online activities, especially in relation to the creation and consumption of content, as much of an economic process, but it's also an important social process under specific political condition. I guess that's a major thing I want to bring to today's discussion.
Thank you. And Ellen, you get the last word.
Okay, what an honor. I am really grateful for everything I've learned about web monetization over the course of the summit. And I'm thinking about how it might relate to the Wikimedia Foundation and our projects like Wikipedia. And I think, like, we mostly want the same things. Like, we want to be able to have equity and like ease of financial distribution. And we want to be, I guess we're both in the open knowledge space also. I think that where I see more concerns is that like Wikipedia as a product is like has a lot of integrity, and we take a lot to build into our policies things that uphold that integrity. And I think the community, as in the Wikimedia community, is happy with the status quo of our donor and donation model. And I actually brought some proof of that by a cute little quote that I got from work. Let me read it out for you. It says, so this is from a donor and they said that something struck me. Years ago, there was a documentary about how an underground system of fungi permeates forests, reaching from tree to tree, supplying nutrients, and possibly even acting as a warning system, mostly invisible, silent, yet so vital. During this unimaginably devastating time, there is a system of kindness and care nourishing our people, often invisible, quiet, but enduring. We feel it, and it sustains us if we just allow ourselves to be open to it. Thank you for reaching out and being a part. We will get through this together. So that's what a donor emailed to us after donating to us. So I think there's a community there, and maybe there is hope that altruism exists today.
Well, that's a nice message to end on, and hopefully there is some potential collaboration in the future between the web monetization community and what Wikimedia is working on as well. Thank you everyone for joining us for this session. Appreciate your time today.